A very warm good evening and namaskar to all the viewers of Decoding Elections today. The person that we have today, Mr. Straun Stevenson, is not popular only in Europe, Iran, and Iraq, but also wheresoever literature is being read. And his works, Crying Forever, besides others, are famous after Churchill's essays on war, which won him Nobel, who's been a member of parliament of the European Council from 2009 to 2014, if I'm right, 1999 to 2014. And his essays and columns in newspapers are being read all across the globe. And besides this, he's changing the world through his essays on nature and environment, right? This book came on, which says on the wind and the solar energy. That was the war on sorry, it was, this book was So Much Wind. Yes, you broke the myth of wind energy,
and
right?
Stalin's war on nature.
Yes, Stalin's war on nature, and this book So Much Wind. Yes, so we are,
But my most recent book is this one.
yes, your recent book, this is which I came across, and that's how I decided to finally speak to you, because I've been reading a lot of columns of yours, and finally once again, and since I was preparing for this interview of yours, I have had so much of world knowledge in a single hour, than and then one could, through reading a lots of books. So very warm welcome to the viewers of our show, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Okay, sir, firstly, speaking about your recent book, 10 Meals That Changed the World. So how did this idea come up to your mind, that why would you only focus on the meals?
Well, as you said in your very kind introduction, I was a member of the European Parliament for 15 years, 3 successive elections before I retired as a member of the European Parliament. But during that time, I, of course, traveled a great deal. I was president of the European Parliament's delegation for relations with Iraq. So I had to travel frequently to Iraq, to Afghanistan, to many countries in the Middle East. But I was also a president of the Fisheries Committee. And because the European Parliament were doing business, selling fish and buying fish from countries around the world, I had to travel to those countries to negotiate the arrangements, to see that the fish was healthy and was suitable for being imported into the European Union, and to negotiate sales of our fish to those countries. And that took me to many, many countries around the globe. On one of the earlier visits, I was in America, in Washington, D.C., and I had a spare afternoon to go and visit some of the local sites. I went to Alexandria Old Town, which is very historic part of the early settlement of the American colonies. And there is a house that belonged to a Scotsman. I'm also Scottish, so this, of course, raised my interest. His name was John Carlyle. He was one of the first people to settle in North America, in Alexandria Old Town. He was an entrepreneur, and he became very wealthy, producing all kinds of goods that people required in those days. And he built himself a rather fashionable, at that time, brick-built, stone-built house, very similar to the kind of houses you see in Scotland from that same period. And it was in this house that the most famous meeting of the early colonial days took part. King George II told General Edward Braddock that he should travel to Washington with 1,500 redcoat English troops. General Braddock was also Scottish, by the way. And When he arrived in Alexandria Old Town, having sailed up the Potomac after crossing the Atlantic, he landed in Alexandria. He saw this rather nice house and he commandeered it. And then he summons the 5 colonial governors at that time. The colonial governors came from Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, and Maryland. They had never met before, these 5 guys. It was very difficult to travel from one colony to another in those days. And for them to be summoned to meet in John Carlyle's house in Alexandria Old Town was incredible. They then had a famous dinner. And at the dinner, General Braddock said, "The king has ordered me to tell you, you have to start raising taxes to pay for the war against the French and the Native Americans, the Red Indians." And this was the first time that anyone had mentioned taxation without representation. And there was a young man, a subaltern head of the militia, only 21 years old, who also was attending that dinner by coincidence. And his name just happened to be George Washington. Mm-hmm. And that was the first time he had heard of this taxation policy, which eventually led to the American Revolution. So I saw exactly where they sat for the dinner. I saw the menu. I knew what they ate. And it suddenly occurred to me, my God, this dinner and the discussion they had over this dinner, aided by the food they ate and the alcohol they drank or whatever they drank, must have had an incredible impression on all of those attending, including George Washington. And it then occurred to me, you know, this would be a great idea for a book. So that was how the whole situation started.
So yes, sir, I read these 10 revolutions or these 10 dinners that you were talking around. Now that, because we cannot discuss all those dinners because there is so much more to you, which is much more interesting, and you are a Wikipedian yourself. So quickly, I want to ask, which out of these 10 dinners that you say has impacted the world as greatly as nothing else? I mean, my favorite would be when Churchill, Stalin, and this Roosevelt met in 1943 to prevent against Hitler. So which one is your favorite dinner that you say out of all these 10 meals?
Well, you know, the one you just mentioned, when we had the Tehran conference in the Second World War involving Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, that was a very interesting episode because, of course, Churchill spoke openly about what he called dining diplomacy, how you could win an argument over a dinner or over food and alcohol, which he was an expert in. He allegedly was drinking champagne even with his breakfast. Indeed, when Churchill eventually died, his favorite champagne, Paul Roger, they put a black line around the label on their bottles for a whole year after his death. So they appreciated his custom. But that particular dinner, it had never taken place before because this was in 1943. Churchill and Roosevelt met in Cairo on the way to Tehran. They had never met personally with Stalin. Stalin had been reluctant even to attend this dinner. He said he was scared about flying, but they persuaded him that he should come to Tehran. When they met, it was decided that over the 3 nights of the conference, the summit meeting, each of them should host a dinner on each of the 3 nights. The first night was Roosevelt's turn, and he, of course, held a steak and a burger barbecue. Churchill was ill that evening. He had a sore throat. He was also in a very bad temper because he had not got on very well with his initial meeting with Roosevelt in Cairo. He was still fighting with him, and Roosevelt started trying to make friends with Stalin and discovered that the easiest way to make friends with Stalin was for both of them to make fun of Churchill. And Stalin got very enthusiastic about this, you know, challenging him about his cigars and his John Bull Britishness and all his different idiosyncrasies. And of course, this made Churchill more angry and more angry. He took to his bed and didn't attend the first night's dinner. So the summit meeting started very badly. On the second day, it was the turn of Stalin to host a dinner. And on this occasion, things got so bad that on one case, Churchill walked out of the room where the dinner was being held in the Soviet legation in Tehran. This was because Stalin said, after we defeat the Nazis, I suggest that we summarily execute 30,000 of the Wehrmacht officers, the army officers. And Roosevelt said, yes, I think that's maybe a bit much, maybe 38,000 would be, maybe 28,000 would be enough, not 30,000. And Roosevelt's son was there and he said, yes, I want to agree with my father. I think we should execute 28,000. And Churchill just exploded. He said the British people would never accept such a massacre. That would be horrific. And he got up and stomped out of the room. And Stalin and his foreign minister, Molotov, had to pursue him into this side room and persuade him that they'd only been joking and that he should come back to the dinner. So the first 2 days of the summit meeting were not going well at all. And the three, or Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill were called the Big Three. The Little Three were the second in command, and that was Sir Anthony Eden, who was the foreign minister for Britain, Harry Hopkins, who was, some people said he was more powerful than Roosevelt in America, and Molotov, who was the foreign minister from Russia. The Little Three, as they were known, were having difficulty trying to get any agreement. Stalin particularly wanted Churchill to agree to a May invasion of the European Union. He wanted France to be invaded in May to take some of the Nazis away from the East Front, where his troops were suffering a lot. And of course, Churchill was not prepared to agree to that. So it all came to the third night of the conference, which happened to coincide with Churchill's 69th birthday. And he invited Stalin and Roosevelt to come to the British legation. He had a ramp specially for Roosevelt's wheelchair to be able to get up to the second floor, where he had an elaborate dining table set with silver forks, knives, spoons, 3 glasses for wine, you know, a white wine glass, a red wine glass, and a small glass for port. And of course, whenever Stalin saw this, he said, this is typical British bourgeois nonsense, you know. But then he was heard to ask Churchill's interpreter, Major Boris, which knives and forks should I use for my different food? So, you know, the evening had started badly, but when Churchill's birthday cake came in with 69 candles in the shape of a victory V, there was great applause. And then Stalin stood up with a full glass of wine and said, I want to give a toast to my fighting friend Churchill, and downed the glass of wine in water the way you would with a small vodka. He took the whole glass. And of course, everyone in the room, there were admirals, generals, diplomats, they all followed suit. And then Stalin turned to Roosevelt and had his glass totally filled again and said to my fighting friend Roosevelt, and knocked it back again. And of course, everyone in the room followed suit. And then Churchill gave his toast. And each time people were knocking back a whole glass of wine until all the toasts were finished. And at that stage, Roosevelt was looking so tired. He said he had to go to bed early. He left at 11 o'clock. Stalin and Churchill disappeared into another room with Molotov, Stalin's foreign minister. And about 1 o'clock in the morning, one of Churchill's aides went to see what was happening and said in his diary that he discovered the two leaders surrounded by empty bottles, both absolutely, drunk and toasting each other. He heard Churchill stand up, pour himself a large drink and say, "Here is a toast to the Russian proletariat." And Stalin then poured a large glass of wine and said, "And here is my toast to the British Conservative Party," which was extraordinary. So obviously, Churchill's dining diplomacy had worked. And by the next morning, there was no sign of the three leaders until much later in the morning. But the little three managed to get together and said, things are looking better. Churchill agreed that he would invade on the 6th of June, 1943 for Operation Overlord, 1944, sorry, for D-Day. And Roosevelt's idea of setting up an international body after the war to secure peace, which became the United Nations, that was agreed. And then Stalin also, in turn, he agreed that he would wage war against Japan after he had managed to help the defeat of the Nazis. So all of these agreements came about, I think, because of Churchill's dining diplomacy and his thrifty dinner on that fateful evening in November.
So thank you for giving us in detail what happened on that fateful night, which led to change in so much of world history. But since, sir, you have been mentioning about dinner diplomacy, I also want to bring to your knowledge, though I'm sure you might be aware, back here in India, there is a diplomacy through the Mughals that is practiced. That's called as mango diplomacy. Have you heard about mango diplomacy?
No.
Mao, you have mentioned about Mao, and there's this dinner between Nixon and Mao. So similarly, yeah. Mao was very much, interested into mangoes, and there are historical events that his fascination for mangoes let half of the China put billboards of mango because Mao liked mangoes a lot. So it is still today in local politics of India. Recently, Bangladesh's Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina ji has sent 2,600 kgs of mango to India, and to Indian Prime Minister Modi ji. And similarly, Pakistan and India on international stages keep sending their variety of mangoes to various leaders to reclaim that, identically which mango belongs to which country better. So because we were talking about dinner diplomacy, so sir, since have you watched Game of Thrones? There is one dinner that is mentioned in Game of Thrones in which there occurred an execution. I am not sure of which that dinner was. Do you happen to recall this dinner in the history that all people were killed in this historical dinner by somebody?
Where a dinner where all the people were killed at the dinner?
Yeah. There's in Game of Thrones, this dinner is mentioned historically. There was some dinner. I thought that you might have mentioned.
I regret to say I never watched Game of Thrones.
Okay, sir. What I was surprised to find is because you have been coming as close to Mao and speaking about Nixon and Mao dinner, but we did not find any Indian dinner over there. So that's my complaining to you.
Well, funnily enough, I've written a follow-up to this book, The Second Course of History, Other Great Meals That Changed the World. And one of them is the famous visit of President Nero to JFK, to John Kennedy, Jack Kennedy,
Yes.
in America, where things went badly wrong because JFK decided that all the men, including Nero, should meet in a separate room, and all the women, including Jackie Kennedy, should meet with Indira Gandhi, who, of course, was accompanying Nero, in a separate room. And Indira Gandhi did not like that at all. And she was openly rude to Jackie Kennedy. And Jackie Kennedy, in her memoirs, said she had a very sour attitude and looked like a woman that was sucking lemons all the time. And this did not help because Indira Gandhi was, of course, a key advisor for Nero, and told Nero that this was not good policy. So JFK, in his reminiscences, said this was one of the worst state visits he ever undertook. So it was quite interesting because the dinner that the men had coincided with the dinner that the women had, but they were in separate rooms. So you'll have to wait until the follow-up book comes out until you read about that.
Yes, since we are talking about dinners and we are talking about modern history, I'm just going to also bring to your knowledge the recent developments in dinner diplomacy that has happened post Johnny Depp winning the case against Amber. And, he went to a famous Indian restaurant, spending lots of money. I hope that
I saw that he took over the entire restaurant, costing many thousands of pounds, which he paid to the restaurateur, and presumably left a very large tip for the waiters and waitresses.
Yes, sir. Coming to serious topics, because I really want to do justice to your wisdom and knowledge more than dinner, sir, because you have been an activist on awareness on radioactive uses by Russia from 1949 to 1990 in Kazakhstan region, and for which you wrote an essay that Crying Forever, which even won $50,000 US dollars, and you donated all of that. So what is this cause that you are propaganding or creating awareness for? What is this use of nuclear weapons, and where did it happen? Please tell us something more about it.
Well, this was during Stalin's time. And it was when the arms race was taking place. America had already successfully detonated a nuclear bomb. Sadly, they had used it aggressively in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War. And Stalin was determined that he wanted to develop nuclear weapons as well, to keep up sides with the American enemy, as he regarded them. So he sectioned off a huge area of East Kazakhstan. The area then was called Semipalatinsk, which was the capital city of that area. It's now called Semi. And this area was closely guarded by thousands of KGB officers and military personnel. So people living within the area, initially, they were very proud because they thought all of the infrastructure that's going to be built, they had new roads, new electricity cables were laid, new water supplies. So they thought, this is terrific. We're now being chosen for this special privilege. But in fact, Stalin intended to use the villagers who lived in that area, this wide scattered area of the Russian steppe, of the Soviet steppe. He wanted to use them as human guinea pigs because this is where he tested his nuclear bombs. And hundreds of nuclear bombs were detonated. Many of them detonated in the atmosphere, above ground. And the KGB would wait until the wind was blowing towards the villages. Then they would detonate the bomb. And then they would study over the years that progressed the effect of the radiation on the villagers. Now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, this whole area opened up. All the infrastructure has long since rotted away. There are no good roads. Some villages have no water. Water has to be delivered by tankers. I went to visit these villages and found an area of terrible devastation. The children, babies that are born with terrible deformities caused by the genetic multiplier effect of their parents being, or their grandparents being affected by radiation. The food that they eat is radioactive. The water they drink is radioactive. The level of cancers runs at about 10 times the national average. And the result is a lot of people committing suicide, even children. The title of my essay that won the international $50,000 prize, Crying Forever, that was taken from a gravestone that had a picture of a 13-year-old girl, and her father had carved on the gravestone, "Crying forever for my daughter who killed herself at the age of 13. I mean, he used a euphemism on the gravestone. He said, "She left us at the age of 13. But these were suicides of young people who, even a young girl of 13 had developed breast cancer. Her mother had died of cancer. Her siblings were suffering from cancer. She killed herself. And this is commonplace. So I started raising funds to try to help these people and to try and raise awareness. I launched a book called Crying Forever in the United Nations in New York, in their headquarters. And I think it raised awareness and it helped. We got the European Union to allocate millions in their budget to help the people of Semipalatinsk, of the polygon, as it's known over there.
Not only that, you were also awarded with Mercy Award by the President of Kazakhstan. Your book was launched at the UN headquarters. And I must say, sir, going back, listening to those stories that you have just recalled, our hearts just cry listening, because we have been very privileged and we know not what went through these people and how they, suffered. And when you tell us these stories through your books, literature, and words, our heart just cries for these people and the bad things that have been done to them through the selfishness of some humans. Is this
because many people thought that there were no actual victims of the Cold War, but in fact there were real victims of the Cold War, victims of the nuclear tests. And when President Reagan accused the Russians of conducting these nuclear tests because they'd been doing it in complete secrecy, in breach of the nuclear test ban treaty. When he accused the Russians, they immediately started testing all their nuclear weapons underground. And on one occasion, in, again, the same area, the polygon in East Kazakhstan, they caused a mountain to collapse, and it created what to this day is known as the atomic lake, a lake that nothing lives in the lake or around the lake. It's completely radioactive. I went to visit it and I had to be accompanied by 2 scientists, and we had to wear protective clothing to stop us suffering from the effects of radiation.
so? Sir, now that this topic has again gained prominence because Russians are again invading that same region of Ukraine and Kazakhstan, right? Not Kazakhstan, but Ukraine prominently, right? But you see that there is this Chernobyl area over there that is again having nuclear reactors, and that is very much at risk of being exploded. That's why again your words and your works are coming to the forefront, right? What's your take on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and a risk to the Chernobyl nuclear reactors?
Well, one of the first aggressive acts that Vladimir Putin obviously instructed was an attack on the Chernobyl nuclear reactor. I mean, how incredibly stupid to start bombing the Chernobyl nuclear reactor, which we know the problems it caused. Here, where I live in Scotland, in southwest Scotland, a farm was affected by radiation from the Chernobyl, the meltdown that the nuclear reactor suffered famously. And that farm was closed by the government for years, was only finally allowed to reopen again to sell cattle and sheep last year. I mean, that's how long Scotland, thousands of miles from Chernobyl, and we were affected by rain clouds that had gathered the radiation and flown and moved right over Scotland. And then the downpours polluted some of our land here. So a lot of Europe was affected by that. For Putin to order the attack on Chernobyl was so incredibly stupid and shows that Putin himself is deranged. I mean, there are a lot of rumors that the man is ill, and I can only hope his illness is serious, because this is a very dangerous thing to create a war in Europe. 30,000 young Russians have been killed and almost as many young Ukrainians. It's an appalling carnage, and it's genocide caused by an illegal and criminal invasion of Ukraine by the Russians.
I understand, sir. Sir, in your book, Stalin's Legacy, The War on Nature, is this only what you speak about the nuclear tests that were done in Kazakhstan? Is this do you speak in this over these topics only?
No, that particular book was based on my work as roving ambassador for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. I was invited to write a report on the environmental damage that had been caused in all the Central Asian republics, in all 5 Central Asian republics. So I had to visit Turkmenistan, which Turkmenistan is almost like North Korea. I mean, it is an incredibly backward country. Uzbekistan, which is a more forward-looking country, but still under a dictatorship. Kazakhstan, of all of the 5 Central Asian republics, was probably the most progressive and the most open to inward investment from the West. And as a result, the standard of living was increasing all the time. But all of these countries suffered environmental damage caused by the Soviets. One of the worst bits of damage was, of course, the complete destruction of the Aral Sea. I visited a small village in Uzbekistan, which used to be a fishing port. It's a village called Moynak, and it's where fishermen used to land 15,000 tons of fish every year. Now the sea is about 100 miles from that village. Nothing surrounds it except sand and desert. You can see the old wall of the harbor and the derelict wooden ships that are lying rotting in the sunshine in the sand. The whole area, the Aral Sea, was desiccated because Stalin wanted to build canals to take water away from the Aral Sea to use for irrigating crops of cotton, which he required to give uniforms for his military personnel. And the destruction of all these canals and irrigation systems desiccated the Aral Sea. He sprayed the cotton with DDT, which is a lethally toxic chemical. And of course, after the sea disappeared and the sandstorms started to blast all over the villages and the surrounding area, they carried in the sand particles elements of DDT toxins. And again, you have a horrible legacy of babies being born with deformities and chronic illness. So my book covered all of these issues, not just the nuclear issue.
So your book, Crying Forever, it is in two versions, a nuclear diary 2016, 2006, and a Russian version. What is a Russian version? That's the translation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought that's the Russian, from the Stalin's point of view, why we did those nuclear bombs.
There was also a Kazakh translation because the people of the polygon, most of them speak only Kazakh, not Russian. They wanted to see what I had written, and it was illustrated with many photographs that I took in that area of the people who live there, and many of the elderly people told you what it was like to see a nuclear explosion within 20 miles, and that suffered the consequences. Some of the people that I met, they were dying of cancer when I spoke to them, and they were particularly keen to read this book, so I got it translated into Kazakh for their purpose. In Scotland, with a government who are nationalist and who have an obsession with wind power, because we get a lot of wind in Scotland, and they have famously said that Scotland could become the Saudi Arabia of wind energy. So they have started building wind turbines from one end of Scotland to the other, also on land, in the sea. But where they build them is a problem, because Scotland has a rich heritage of peatland. Peat is, as you know, it's many millennia of rotted trees that have formed into a massive carbon stores. And if you start digging up peatland, you're releasing stored carbon into the atmosphere. Now, peatland is not productive for agriculture. And of course, that then, for the owners of peatland, that becomes the ideal place to sell their land to the energy companies to come and dig up the peat and build wind turbines. The landowners then make lots of money from very unproductive land, and the Scottish government says, aren't we doing well building all these wind turbines all over Scotland? But in the meantime, they're digging up peat, releasing millions of years of stored carbon into the atmosphere, causing virtually a counter effect. And the promise of green jobs in our economy is nonsense. I think of the many hundreds of gigantic industrial turbines covering Scotland now, ruining some of our most beautiful landscape. I don't think a single one of them has been built in Scotland. They are built in Denmark, in Holland, in Germany, and they're imported into Scotland. Many of them are built in China. The Chinese are opening a new coal-fired power station every week to provide the steel to build the wind turbines that they then export to Scotland. And their coal-fired power stations are wrecking the atmosphere. So, my book was trying to point out that the unintended consequences of this revolution in green energy is actually counterproductive and is producing exactly the opposite effect of what was intended.
I can see that, sir. The other environmental issue that you have raised was ban on cat and dog fur. And you got over 1 million emails and signatures, right? So what was the impact of your this campaign that you started? Has cat and fur, dog fur been banned in the entire UK and Scotland?
No, this was actually much bigger than that. When I was a member of the European Parliament, this was a law that I managed to introduce, but it took 8 years of struggle. And this law applies to the whole of Europe. And the law banned the import, export, and sale of cat and dog fur. I was approached shortly after I was elected as an MEP back in 1999. I was approached by Humane Society International from America, who had been campaigning on this issue in America. And they asked me if I would join their and help their campaign to introduce a ban in Europe, because they said literally millions of cats and dogs are being slaughtered, often cruelly slaughtered, in Russia and in China to supply Europe with fur to make fur coats, rugs. I went to Berlin and discovered and bought a full-length fur coat. We had it DNA tested, and it was made from the skin of 6 German Shepherd dogs. I went to Copenhagen in Denmark and bought a rug, a beautiful rug. It turned out it was made from about 50 Labrador puppies. So toys of little cats in baskets, which you maybe are familiar with. People buy these as souvenirs because they love cats and dogs. And they buy these little toy cats and dogs sitting in a basket or doing playful things. The skins, when we DNA tested them, were made from real cats and dogs, which they killed for that purpose. So this horrible cruelty, had to be stopped. I, of course, went to Beijing on 2 occasions and confronted their Minister of Agriculture, who was responsible for the welfare of cats and dogs. He denied that it was happening. When I showed him a film that had been secretly taken by Humane Society International of a Chinese man killing a dog and skinning it while it was still blinking, still alive. He said this was a Taiwanese spy doing it in China to try to discredit the Chinese. A ludicrous story. But I was fighting all the time the European Commission, who said, oh no, we can't introduce a law like this because China will take us to the international courts and say that we're introducing barriers to trade. And I said, well, we have 1 million signatures from citizens of Europe demanding this. And I doubt if China would ever have the courage to take us to court on such a cruel issue. And when we finally persuaded the European Commission to introduce this law, of course, China backed down. They never took us to court. So that law still prevails to this day, even in Britain, despite Brexit.
Kudos to you, sir, and a big hats off to you. Now that this law is there, the cats and dogs who are alive today in China will never know who to thank for. But we can thank you for this. Sir, now coming back to your other book, A Self-Sacrifice, Life with Iranian Mujahideen. What is it about?
Well, again, during my time in the European Parliament, when you're an MEP, you get ambassadors beating a path to your door, wanting to come and speak to you. And in my first year as an MEP, I was asked if I would meet the ambassador from the Islamic Republic of Iran. When he came to see me, he was determined to tell me all about the wonderful things that the Islamic Republic was achieving. I showed him a newspaper cutting which indicated that a 14-year-old girl had been executed, hanged by the Iranian regime. She had been raped by a member of the Basiji paramilitary force. The man who raped her had been sentenced to 50 lashes and 1 year imprisonment. But she, for being a child, allowing a man to rape her, was sentenced to death. She was so appalled at the cruelty and the idiocy of this sentence, she tore her veil off in the court. And the judge said, right, for insulting my court by removing your veil, I am going to put the rope around your neck myself. He hanged her. When I showed the ambassador this, I said, I want you now to leave my office and never come back to try to meet me again. And I pledge I am now going to fight for human rights and for an attack on the regime that you represent, for the violation of human rights and for crimes against humanity. I then sought some people that had previously approached me in the parliament. They were working on behalf of the main democratic opposition group, the People's Mujahideen of Iran, the Mujahideen, which is the PMOI-MEK. And I said to them, tell me what I can do to help. And from that day on, I have very much engaged with them, because I learned then all of the atrocities that had happened, including in 1988, when Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the person who introduced the theocratic regime after the 1979 revolution, when he introduced a fatwa against the Mujahideen and instructed all people who claimed to support the Mujahideen should be executed. Apparently 30,000 were hanged in a period of 6 months in the second half of 1988. We now have massive evidence to support this. The new president of Iran, Ebrahim Raisi, has boasted about the part he played in that massacre when he was a judge. And he was one of the ones sentencing people after arbitrary 3-minute trials. They would be asked a simple question: do you still support the Mujahideen? If they said yes, they were immediately taken into a large hall in the prison and hanged in batches of 10 at a time. We know that Raisi is guilty of this. He has boasted about playing his role in this. And he has actually said anyone who supports the Mujahideen deserves to be executed. We want him hauled in front of the International Criminal Court and tried for genocide and crimes against humanity. I have lodged a major dossier, over 100 pages of evidence from survivors and victims' families from that massacre, with the Metropolitan Police in London and the police service in Scotland, calling for Ebrahim Raisi's arrest if he tries to set foot in the United Kingdom. He had intended coming to the COP26 environmental conference in Scotland, in Glasgow, last November. And when he heard that we had lodged this petition with the police, he decided that he had other engagements and decided not to come to Scotland. So believe me, if he sets foot in the UK, or perhaps anywhere in Europe, he faces arrest. the United Nations are now investigating this horrible massacre in 1988.
Sir, it takes serious guts to, call a spade, and you are fighting the devils with their horns and heads on. So I know that takes a lot of courage. But once again, that's what you are known for, and that's why, you have been a voice and champion of the crimes against humanity. And just letting the world know what all happened is a big thing in itself, because most of the world never will know what happened back then or is still happening over there in that country. So you have
Well, I lecture internationally on human rights. That's now my main job, as well as being a writer. And before the pandemic, I was lecturing in universities like George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and Berkeley University in San Francisco, and universities around the whole of Europe and around America. So, that's what I do. I've also lectured in Oxford and Cambridge in the UK.
So now coming back to the next question that I want to ask. Iran working out on secret nuclear weapons. Why is Biden rushing towards Iran and giving them a gift of goodies? And why the Iranian protests this time are different?
Well, there's been an interesting development now in Iran in the last week, where the person responsible for the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, responsible for monitoring the situation in Iran, he has reported that the Iranians are not cooperating. And in fact, yesterday, the Iranian regime took down 27 of the IAEA's cameras that were monitoring their nuclear facilities. They have actually removed these cameras to stop the international community being able to see what they're doing. Now, of course, for the last 20 years, we have had very good sources within Iran informing us through the Mujahideen, through the democratic opposition around the world, about the clandestine nuclear program and Iran's determination to build a nuclear weapon. But the appeasement policy followed by the West, particularly by the Europeans, has allowed the Iranians to continue with this policy. Obama's 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA nuclear deal that he signed with the Iranians was ludicrous, was deeply flawed. It was for only a period of 10 years. It prohibited, on the demand of the Iranian regime, access by the Atomic Energy Agency to any military sites inside Iran. Now, the military sites are where all of the nuclear proliferation is taking place. So to say you cannot visit the military sites was completely crazy. And that's why President Trump, who didn't do very many right things, but the one right thing that he did was to withdraw America unilaterally from the JCPOA nuclear deal. President Biden, bizarrely, has been trying to resurrect this zombie deal ever since he became president. As you're probably aware, the talks in Vienna have stalled because the Iranians are demanding two immediate things: the lifting of all sanctions imposed by President Trump and the Americans, which would enable them to start refunding Hezbollah, Bashar al-Assad's civil war in Syria, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, the Shia militia in Iraq. They're fighting proxy wars around the Middle East, using billions of oil revenues before America imposed its tough sanctions. And of course, the mullahs are venally corrupt. They are some of the richest people in the Middle East. But the 80 million population of Iran are starving. They're taking to the streets virtually every day in nationwide protests. Right now, it's the pensioners who are complaining that they have not enough money to live on. They say that about 60 to 70% of the Iranian population now are living below the international poverty line of $2 a day income. So this is a venally corrupt and evil regime. And I am determined to do what I can to achieve its downfall and replacement with a democratic, secular government. Of course, Iran's big ally in all of this is Russia. And Iran has backed the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is not surprising. And Iran is now selling oil in breach of the sanctions, because the Russians, of course, pay no attention to American sanctions. They're selling a lot of their surplus crude oil to Russia. And that's where the money is still coming from that enables them to continue funding their proxy wars and to continue filling their own pockets corruptly. So this is, an evil regime and should be brought to account, held to account.
Winds of change are blowing in Baghdad. What winds of change?
Well, the winds of change in Baghdad, we have a president who, a prime minister, who for the first time is from no particular party. He was, of course, an arch enemy as a journalist of Saddam Hussein. He spent a lot of time in the United Kingdom. He then went back after the fall of Saddam to become head of security. He has no particular love of any of the political factions, like some of the very pro-Iranian factions. The Iranians almost regard Iraq now as a protectorate. It's almost become a province of Iran. But they have also colluded in the massacre of the Sunni population. So when they were encouraging the former Prime Minister of Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki, to crack down hard on the Sunni population in Iraq. And that created almost a civil war that when ISIS invaded Iraq and took over almost 30% of the geographical territory of the country, the Sunnis in the areas like Mosul, Ramadi, the areas that were taken over by ISIS, Fallujah, those areas which were predominantly Sunni, they actually welcomed the ISIS because they saw ISIS as fellow Sunnis. Mm-hmm. And Iran then took the opportunity of saying, we will come to help you to get rid of these ISIS terrorists. And they sent their godfather of terror, General Qasem Soleimani, who you may recall on the 2nd of January 2020 was killed by a drone attack in Baghdad airport, ordered by President Trump. And of course, that's caused great consternation in the mullahs society in Iran. But General Qasem Soleimani was sent to get rid of ISIS. And in doing that, he managed to unite all the disparate militias, Shia militias, inside Iraq. He called them the Popular Mobilization Force. And he used them effectively to create genocide in these great cities like Fallujah, Ramadi, and Mosul, killing literally tens of thousands of Sunni men. The women and children were the only survivors. And he left in his wake smoking ruins where these ancient cities used to stand. These cities have not yet been rebuilt. But this was Iran's way of saying, well, we are helping the West to counter ISIS terrorists. And of course, in doing so, they were committing a genocide against the Sunni population and trying to enlarge their hold, their grip, their vice-like grip over the whole of Iraq, which they still have to this day. So I'm hoping that Prime Minister Abadi may be a breath of fresh air. He is a friend of the Americans. He is not an enemy of Tehran, but he wants to gradually move the Iranian agents out of his country. I hope that he tries to take the popular mobilization militias and involve them in the military of Iraq and give them a formal role as a military and no longer have them as politicized militias who use their weapons for political gain.
Sir, now that because we have been speaking the world with you, wanted to know about your relations with Margret Thatcher, in whose cabinet you served as a member of parliament during her reign, right? She was upset with you over something I read somewhere.
I wasn't in her cabinet. I was never a member of the British Parliament, only the European Parliament. But yeah, I met her when she was still leader. She had just become leader of the opposition at that time, before she became Prime Minister. And she came to Scotland, and I was very much in favour of Scottish devolution, of giving the Scots a devolved assembly, which would become, it's almost quasi-government in Scotland, which is exactly what we now have, thanks to Tony Blair, not to Maggie Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher came to a conference in Scotland when she was leader of the opposition, and she said, I'm having nothing to do with devolution. It's a gift to the nationalists, and the Conservative Party will have no truck with devolution. And I put my hand up, and she said, yes. And I said, is that not going to simply hand a gift to the nationalists because you're saying the Tories are the only party that is against devolution? The nationalists will use this as ammunition against us. And her husband was sitting next to her, Dennis Thatcher. He leant forward, about to say something, and she put her hand over his mouth. She put her hand right over her husband's mouth and shouted at me, I'm not going to have defeatism in my party. And I thought, oh my word, this lady is something else, you know? So yeah, that was the end of devolution under the Conservatives. And we had to wait until, I said to many Conservatives at the time, every party in Scotland, apart from the Conservative Party, is in favour of devolution. One day we will lose the election, and then we will have devolution forced upon us by another party. Wouldn't it be better, while we're in power under Maggie Thatcher, to have our own Conservative form of devolution? And of course, that's exactly what happened. Tony Blair eventually won the election in 1997, and he imposed Labour devolution on Scotland, saying, the way we have evolved the voting system will prohibit any single party ever winning an absolute majority in the new Scottish Parliament. In fact, that did not happen, 14 years ago, the SNP won an absolute majority, and they still have a majority. They have been running Scotland for the past 14 years. So, you know, Tony Blair's wonderful system broke apart very quickly.
So, because that incident really did make you popular early on in your career with Margaret Thatcher, right? So,
you have been reading an awful lot into my background, I think.
I have, sir. You are an interesting person, and plus, you are doing so much for the society and humanity and whatnot. I really, really appreciate that, sir. So, coming back, sir, since you have been being followed by the ex-president of United States, Mr. Barack Obama. So who are you closer to now? Tony Blair, Barack Obama, Boris Johnson? Who is your current favorite amongst all these?
That's a very difficult question. The BBC asked me that question 2 weeks ago. Okay. They said, should Boris Johnson resign? And I said, Boris Johnson should stand up and be counted by calling a vote of confidence in himself and then see how his party votes. Well, of course, he didn't call a vote of confidence on himself, but sufficient number of Conservative MPs wrote letters to the Backbench 1922 committee, which triggered a vote of confidence, which, as we now know, he won. No one can now call another vote of confidence for at least a year. Mm-hmm. So it would be unwise of me to say what my position is on Boris Johnson for at least another 12 months.
Seems you have good relations with him. But so who is better to you, Tony Blair, Boris, or Barack Obama, Donald Trump, or Joe Biden?
Well, you know, I never thought that I would hear myself saying this as a conservative. But, you know, I read recently Tony Blair's autobiography. And, you know, when I think back to the years of Tony Blair, when, of course, I was opposing him, I was an elected member of the European Parliament. I was opposing him all the time. But in those days, we had a very strong economy. We were a full member and an active member of the European Union. Tony Blair made sure that we had a rebate on our massive budget contribution to the European Union. We never joined Schengen, so we had all sorts of opt-outs. We never joined the Eurozone. We still had the British pound. We had the best of every possible world. And really, we had a strong government. Now we have after 2 years of pandemic, of course, and the war in Ukraine, we have a cost of living crisis. We have energy prices going through the roof. We're going to have a food security crisis now because of the Ukrainian war. I look back to the days of Tony Blair, you know, with kind of longing, which I never thought I'd hear myself say, sadly.
Because we are running very short of time and only have 4 minutes, I'm asking you the final questions. One is, sir, did you watch this movie called Seaspiracy on Netflix? Because being a member of the European Parliament, you were the committee chairman for the fisheries department, and you would go and procure the fishes for your country. But the crime against the fishes that's been happening, that has been shown to us through this documentary called Seaspiracy. And there are a lot of sharks, whales, and dolphins that are being killed for typically no reason or for very petty reasons, right? What is your take on this, and what are the changes as you have done in cats and dogs for case? Should you bring something like this on this fishes and
yeah, I mean, we did a great deal of work when I was president of the Fisheries Committee in Europe to ban the illegal killing of dolphins, particularly in the tuna fishery, where sharks and dolphins were often being captured and killed. We introduced a ban on shark finning, where sharks were being brought on board, the fins cut off because the fins are sold for a great deal of money, particularly again in China. They see them as some sort of health restorative ingredient. And the sharks very often, with their fins cut off, were being thrown alive back into the sea. So we banned that. We said it is illegal now to land shark fins anywhere in Europe, or for European boats to land shark fins in any other country outside of Europe, unless they are attached to a shark that is part of a sustainable fishery. So we did a lot of work in this. The illegal unreported fishing, unregulated fishing, which takes place around the world. The Chinese are one of the worst offenders. They have one of the biggest fleets in the world, and they are very much engaged, particularly in West Africa, in sailing within the 12-mile limit of the coast, and illegally fishing with big trawlers that then remove a basic foodstuff for the local population, who cannot afford to have police boats patrolling their coastal waters. So illegal, unregulated fishing is something that we are still working very hard to ban, and Britain is very much part of that, even after Brexit.
But sir, there needs to be done a lot more in this, because this has been exposed to the world through this documentary called Seaspiracy. I'm sure you have seen, and if you have not, I will forward you the link on the Netflix. You should see how big the problem is.
No, I have seen it. It's excellent.
Yeah, and not only in China or in Africa, the problem still lies, and a lot. I just want to bring your attention, because you have been such a champion and so successful in whatsoever you have pursued so far. So I would just, as a request from all the viewers that are seeing me, also bring this to your knowledge, sir. And
this is excellent. Yeah. But
and sir, there is so much that I've learned from you, yet there is so much more to talk to you, which I will surely over the years, and which I'm weaving this friendship between an old man and a young person in pursuit of hunger for knowledge and changing the world, sir. And all these viewers of ours, it has been incredibly beautiful to talk to you, learning from you and everything else. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mayank. It's a pleasure to have spoken to you.
Thank you, sir. And should you be anytime planning to come to India, please do let me know. I will come to pick you at the airport, sir.
I was in India with my wife just before the pandemic, and we had a wonderful holiday there.
Where did you visit? This is off the record.
We flew into Bangalore, of course, and then drove with a driver, because I'd be very scared driving in India, especially in busy cities like Bangalore. We drove right down to Kerala in the south. It was beautiful.
Yes, sir.
Very beautiful.
Next time, should you come, you'll find it even more amazing.
Well, I'm sure. I want to come again. My wife does too.
We'll look forward to you coming, and plus you have a very smiling face, unlike your social media DPs.
Well, talking about India makes me smile.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you once again, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been an honor to speak to you. Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.